Another day, another story. Political theorist Francis Fukuyama famously proclaimed that the end of the Cold War marked the end of history, a triumph of capitalist, liberal Western democracy over competing ideologies. It was believed that 21st century humanity would be a globalized post-conflict society moving in deterministic concert toward collective peace and prosperity. Welcome to Tabo Eminent Channel. While Fukuyama's thesis was profoundly challenged by the September 11, 2001 attacks and the subsequent U.S. war on terrorism, open warfare between the armies of nation-states did, in fact, become increasingly rare in the post-Cold War environment. Instead, terrorism, ethnic conflict, civil wars, and hybrid and special operations warfare, techniques used by developed nations to harass or destabilize opponents through non-traditional means, accounted for the bulk of non-state, intrastate, and interstate violence. 1. Second Congo War, 1998 to 2003. Far and away the deadliest war of the 21st century was a conflict that had its genesis in the 20th. The Rwandan genocide, the toppling and death of Zairian President Mobutu Sese Seko, and ethnic strife between Hutu and Tutsi peoples were direct contributing factors to the Second Congo War, also called the Great War in Africa or Africa's First World War because of its scope and destructiveness. In May 1997, rebel leader Laurent Kabila deposed Mobutu and renamed Zaire the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, but he soon found himself engaged in a civil war with some of the forces that had elevated him to power. The eastern third of the DRC became a battlefield every bit as bloody and contested as the Western Front in World War I had been. The armies of 9 countries and an assortment of affiliated militias devastated the countryside. 2. Syrian Civil War. As the Arab Spring swept through the Middle East and North Africa, popular uprisings toppled the authoritarian regimes in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Yemen. In Syria, however, President Bashar al-Assad responded to protests with a combination of political concessions and escalating violence against his own people. The uprising became a civil war that spread violence into neighboring Iraq and provided a fertile breeding ground for militant groups such as the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, also known as ISIS. Rebel groups seized huge swathes of territory, and the area under government control was reduced to a small strip of land in western Syria. Assad resorted to increasingly desperate and savage measures to maintain power, dropping crude barrel bombs on urban populations and using chemical weapons on rebel-controlled territory. 3. Darfur Conflict. In early 2003, rebel groups took up arms against the Khartoum-based regime of Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, igniting long-standing tensions in the Darfur region of western Sudan. That conflict erupted into what the US government later described as the first genocide of the 21st century. After rebel groups scored a string of high-profile victories against the Sudanese military, the Sudanese government equipped and supported Arab militias that came to be known as Janjaweed. The Janjaweed conducted a targeted campaign of terrorism and ethnic cleansing against the civilian population of Darfur, killing at least 300,000 people and displacing nearly 3 million. It was not until 2008 that a joint United Nations and African Union peacekeeping force was able to restore a semblance of order to the region. 4. Iraq War. Neoconservative officials within the administration of U.S. President George W. Bush had sought to topple the regime of Iraqi President Saddam Hussein prior to the events of September 11, 2001. But the deadliest terrorist attack in U.S. history would provide, at least in part, the casus belli for the Iraq War. Citing links between the Iraqi regime and al-Qaeda as well as the presence in Iraq of weapons of mass destruction, both claims that were ultimately proved false, the U.S. assembled a coalition of the willing, and launched an attack on Iraq on March 20, 2003. The subsequent war unfolded in 2 distinct phases. A short one-sided conventional war, in which coalition forces suffered fewer than 200 fatalities in just over a month of major combat operations. 5. Afghanistan War. Within weeks of the September 11, 2001 attacks, the United States began carrying out airstrikes against the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. The Taliban, an ultra-conservative Islamist faction that seized power in the vacuum left after the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, provided a safe haven for al-Qaeda and its leader, Osama bin Laden. The war in Afghanistan became, for a time, the most obvious manifestation of the US-led war on terrorism. By December 2001, the Taliban had been forced from power, but both the Afghan Taliban and its Pakistani counterpart would recover strength in the tribal areas that straddle the border of those two countries. Revising its tactics to reflect those used by insurgents in Iraq, the Taliban began employing improvised explosive devices, IEDs, on military and civilian targets, to great effect. 6. The war against Boko Haram. The Islamist militant group Boko Haram, a name that means "Westernization is sacrilege" in the Hausa language, was founded in 2002 with the goal of imposing Sharia, Islamic law, on Nigeria. The group was relatively obscure until 2009, when it launched a series of raids that killed dozens of police officers. The Nigerian government retaliated with a military operation that left more than 700 Boko Haram members dead. The Nigerian police and military then conducted a campaign of extrajudicial killing that inflamed what remained of Boko Haram. Beginning in 2010, Boko Haram struck back, assassinating police officers, staging jailbreaks, and attacking civilian targets across Nigeria. Schools and Christian churches in the country's northeast were especially hard hit, and the kidnapping of nearly 300 schoolgirls in 2014 drew international condemnation. 7. Yemeni Civil War. The civil war in Yemen had its genesis in the Arab Spring and the uprising that toppled the government of Ali Abdullah Saleh. As Saleh struggled to maintain his grip on the presidency, he recalled the military from outlying areas to Sana'a, the Yemeni capital. Houthi rebels in the country's north and al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, militants in the south were quick to exploit the power vacuum. Fighting between government forces and opposition tribal militias intensified, and on June 3, 2011, Saleh was the target of an assassination attempt that left him seriously injured. Saleh left Yemen to receive medical treatment, a move that ultimately led to the transfer of power to Saleh's vice president, Abd Rabba Mansur Hadi. 8. Russia-Ukraine War. In February 2014, Ukraine's pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, was swept from power after months of popular demonstrations and a failed violent crackdown on protesters. Yanukovych fled to Russia and, within days of his departure, disguised Russian troops invaded the Ukrainian Autonomous Republic of Crimea. Russian President Vladimir Putin announced the illegal annexation of Crimea in March, and weeks later disguised Russian troops invaded the Ukrainian regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. By early summer in 2014, pro-Russian forces had overrun a sizable swathe of territory, and in July Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 was shot down over rebel-controlled territory by a Russian-supplied surface-to-air missile. Nearly 300 passengers and crew were killed. Thanks for watching. Request you to subscribe the channel.